I'm not gay, mom, I'm just being ironic. My name is Shadow Fan Blackidge. I just took a metric fuckload of acid. The walls are melting, my life is flashing. The crows are demanding my head on a silver platter, much like your mom gave me head. I woke up at the men's club. There were fluids everywhere. In horror I cried out, no homo, no homo. But it may have been too late. I won't discuss what happened that night. Indeed, it was horror beyond my comprehension. I can't be, couldn't be. Am I truly gay? I'll tell you what I am. I am proud of your mother. I got him. It ain't gay if another man vacuum styles your fingers anyway. I stumbled out of that house of sin. Pretty sure I saw Steve was there too. I silently prayed, didn't take part in the festivities. Even thinking about his bareheaded ass makes my dick hard soft. I'm in soft. I'm on my way home. I saw a cloud. That was cool. And then I saw that they were building a new contraption by the mall. I can't believe